We are going beyond the cover tonight with authors speaking at the Greater Pittsburgh Festival of Books. Our next author takes us to the island of Mykonos in Greece. Jeffrey Siger shows us how, while he moved far away, Pittsburgh holds a special place in his heart.
My roots in Pittsburgh and my family are very deep and go way back. My brothers and I are Pittsburgh born, as my father and mother Pittsburghers, and I went to Peabody High School. And so I have those roots from there. We continue to be deeply involved in the Pittsburgh community. The fact that I lived in New York and now live in Greece don't diminish the fact that I bleed black and gold. It happens everywhere. So I'm basically a Pittsburgher that way. In fact, I guess you could say my writing career really ties into Pittsburgh more than anywhere else. When I first went off to school, I thought I was going to be a writer. When I went to high school, I thought I'd be a writer. And I was playing football at that particular time for the Peabody team, and it was not a good team. And after one particular ignominious loss, the mother of our best football player came in and dragged him out of the locker room saying, "You're not going to play for this team and wreck your scholarship." A little later on in the school, I'm in an English class thinking I'm a great writer. And the teacher says, "Here, listen to what this fellow has to say. And you can be like this if you work hard." So I'm listening. He comes in and as I listen, I say, "My God, sounds like Charles Dickens. How can I ever compete with people like this? I better find another career, do something else." Well, I found another career and I did something else. But I'm still right. That guy was far better than I am. That guy was John Edgar Wideman, who, as you know, one of the greatest writers of our generation, or many generations. So Pittsburgh started there. When I went off to university, I went to Washington Jefferson College. I went there because I knew I was going to be a doctor, a physician. There was no question I was being a physician. So I didn't bother to go to Columbia because I didn't need that kind of school in New York. So I go there, and then I decide I'm going to become a political science professor. My father says, "Don't you want to be able to afford to eat?" So I decided to become a lawyer. So I become a lawyer and I get involved in Wall Street. I get involved in a lot of other things. And I spend my life there involved in restaurants, doing a lot of things in New York. I come back to Pittsburgh, as I often do. I come back to Pittsburgh for a family event. And I'm standing around talking to a friend of mine I've known for years. She said, "By the way, Jeffrey, with all the things you've done, is there anything you wish you'd have done?" I said, "Yeah, creative writing." She says, "I would too." I go back to New York. I get an email from her. "Once upon a time there was." I write back. She writes back. Over the next 6 months, we write a novella. She calls me out of the blue and says one day, "Jeffrey, you know what? My husband and I wait every other day to read your writing. We love it. You ought to do this full time." I said, "I'm a named partner in my own New York City law firm making a good living. You want to become a struggling writer? What kind of friend are you?" She says, "Continue to write." So I wrote about 2 or 3 drawer novels. And then it took off. And after 9/11, I decided, you know what? Writing's more important to me. So I'm out of here. So Pittsburgh changed me. It first discouraged me, then it brought me back to writing. And then another serendipitous thing, my writing actually led for me to become a college professor because my alma mater, W&J, invited me back a couple times to teach a writing seminar. Voila, that's Pittsburgh and me. And the reason I wrote my first novel was because I wanted to talk about the culture, the society that I saw on the island of Mykonos, which is now world-renowned as a billionaire's playground, and what I saw happening there. So what inspired me to write about first social issues was that book. I originally thought when I was exposing the underbelly of that sort of life, that I'd be lynched from a tree in the harbor of Mykonos when it came out. But they didn't have any trees, so I figured I was safe. When that book came out, it became the #1 best-selling English language book in Greece, was a top 2 or 3 in Greek, and hit the New York Times radar list of hardcover bestsellers. So I said, you know what, maybe I should continue to do this. Don't be a fool, it's working. So that's what I did. And people said to me, "Why are you exploring such deep issues in the context of a mystery? Don't you think you should be doing it in a literary novel?" Whatever that may be. I said, well, you have to understand, start from the simple premise The purpose of a mystery is to restore order to a fractured society. What that means is you start off with some horrendous act or some murder or something like that. And throughout the book, there are progresses that you progress and you retreat. There are obstacles to overcome. There are problems to deal with. But at the end, there is a resolution. That is something that no matter what the book, even if it's the deepest noir, there's resolution for the protagonist. So people feel it is basically optimistic. So if you are going to address complex social issues, it don't seem preaching and don't seem discouraging, package it in something that's optimistic. And that's the reason why I believe mystery writing is the perfect vehicle for addressing complex social issues, because you keep the reader interested in reading it. Well, my advice, whatever you're writing, you're choosing to, is keep your day job, because writing is a lousy way to make a living, but a wonderful way to make a life. If you go in with that philosophy, you will have a happy life, and God be happy that if it works. But my advice, as far as mystery go, read mysteries, and read mysteries. And when you start to write, sit down every day and write something. I don't care if it's 10 minutes, but write. It's just like exercise. You got to get the mind working, the imagination working. All that has to happen. And then you're going to find yourself going the direction you want. But don't go in thinking you're going to be a bestseller. Go in thinking you're going to do the best you can. My latest novel actually ties into something I was saying before about the mysteries. You want to make sure something is happening in a way that, if you have a core, it's what I see it. If you have a core issue you're making, you've got to set it in the right location. You really do. You can't set something that talks about people starving in Africa in the middle of Los Angeles. It doesn't work. You got to be in the right place. And in this book, what I was doing is I wrote this book during pandemic times. I mean, the country, the world was in the middle of it. But I wanted to write something that didn't either that didn't focus on or ignore the pandemic. I had to find a locale, however, which had at its heart, or at its core, the consequences of the pandemic. So I was trying to find the perfect place for that. The new book is number 12 in this series. It's called One Last Chance. And it involves the concept of a young woman, of a woman who works with my chief inspector. She goes to her village for the funeral of her 104-year-old grandmother. And as she goes there, she finds that she's no longer grieving. She's becoming suspicious, because her grandmother, as old as she was in good health up until near the end. When she died, they found suspicious marks on her arms, as if someone had injected her with something. And she, in the need to try to get to that, starts to talk around to different people and finds several other very old people had passed away. In other words, it's a story about how you are concentrating on horrendous acts that are happening to some of the most vulnerable people in the community by those they trust the most. And it's a need to explore that issue in a place which is going to offer you that opportunity. This is from this book. Okay. Magdalena Zautis knew every pebble, rut, root, and pothole on the mountain path from her ancestral cottage down to the local spring. She made the trek every day, whether she needed water or not. She'd been doing it for more than 100 years, first with her mother when she was 4, later with her own children, grandchildren, and their children and grandchildren. She saw no reason to stop now. Many of her family members had moved to the Greek mainland, other islands, or foreign countries to escape the harsh and subsistence common on the northern Aegean island of Icaria. But making a life away from this place, now known to the world as the island where people forget to die, came at a price, and Magdalena wore black as a sign of her continual mourning for the husband, 4 children, and 3 grandchildren who passed away while she lived on. Longevity was the great blessing or curse of a life lived on Icaria. The average lifespan for men and women extended 10 years longer than elsewhere in Greece, and 1 in 3 residents made it into their 90s. Living past 100 was not uncommon, and those who made it to centenarian status enjoyed a special camaraderie forged through a shared century of maintaining the traditions and observances of their uniquely rigorous island way of life. Magdalena was cheery by nature, not one to dwell on unhappy thoughts. But today she felt particularly sad. The hardest deaths for her to endure, other than those among her family, were of childhood mates who also made it to the century mark or close to it. In each passing, she saw a bit of her own past die with them. Their deaths were to be expected, of course. But over the past week, so many of her friends from other parts of the island, indeed some of the healthiest, had passed on within days of each other. She wished there were no more funerals to attend, except perhaps for her own. No, not yet. She'd survived the pandemics of 1918 and 1920 and 2020 to 2022. It was not yet her time. She heard the somber tolling of the church bells echoing up from the village to the craggy rock and pine tree ravine running by her stone home. In spring, this deep, narrow gorge carried rushing water from the mountain that loomed above her cottage. But for now, it brought news of life events for those who understood the cadence of the bells. Today, they spoke of another soul leaving Magdalena's world. Who? She wondered. Surely she would know the deceased, or at least someone in the family. She knew all the families, except, of course, for the newcomers, but few of them stayed past summer. One of her grandchildren would tell her who had passed on, along with other news from the island grapevine. She no longer walked to town to keep up with the gossip. They wouldn't allow her to make the journey. If they could, they'd have stopped her from making her daily trip to the spring. She smiled, then sighed. I know it's because they care about me, but I can't stop now. I have more to do.
Thank you to Jeffrey Siger for that long-distance call to share the story of his career. Finally, we wanted to end right here in our neighborhood